How does a person rebuild their life after everything they've ever known is suddenly ripped away from them? After the smoke clears, after the silence sets in, after the people they loved are gone, how do they find the strength to stand up again? Welcome to Stories by the King, where we explore the stories that cut deep, the ones that make you question fate, and the ones that remind you that the human spirit is harder to break than we think. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. The night Kofi Mensah found the bag, the rain had been falling for 3 hours straight. He was 32 years old, a mechanic from the Nima district of Accra, Ghana, a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands and asking for nothing more than what was fair. He had a wife named Abina, a 7-year-old daughter named Akojua, and a one-room shop on the edge of the market where he repaired motorcycles, minibuses, and the occasional broken generator. He was not rich, but he was not afraid of the morning. That counted for something. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. The storm had knocked out power across the neighborhood, and Kofi had stayed late to finish patching a trotro engine by candlelight. The owner needed the vehicle before dawn. It was the man's only income, and Kofi understood what that meant. So he worked past midnight, long after his apprentice had gone home, long after the market noise died down and the road outside went quiet. He was walking home through the back alley behind the market, the shortcut he had taken 1,000 times, when his foot caught on something in the dark. He thought it was a dog at first. Then he bent down and felt the rough canvas. A bag. Large, military style, half buried under a collapsed section of the drainage gutter wall, invisible in the darkness and the mud. He dragged it forward and unzipped it. His heart stopped. Money. Stacks and stacks of it, Ghana cedis bundled with rubber bands, and beneath those, thick rolls of US dollars. He could not count it in the dark, but it was more than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. More than his shop made in 10 years. More than his father had earned in a lifetime. For 3-4 minutes, Kofi stood completely still in the rain. He looked left. He looked right. The alley was empty. The city was asleep. The bag sat in the mud between his feet, waiting. A smarter man, or maybe a more frightened one, would have left it there. A wiser man might have walked straight to the police station. But Kofi Mensah was a tired man, a man who had been watching the cost of everything rise while his income stayed the same, a man whose daughter needed school fees he hadn't paid in 2 months. He picked up the bag. He carried it home. He hid it under the floorboards beneath his and Abina's bed and lay awake until morning, listening to the rain. He told no one. Not Abina. Not his brother Emmanuel who lived 2 streets away. Not God, not yet. He wasn't ready for that conversation. But in Accra, secrets have a way of walking on their own feet. 3 days later, 2 men came to his shop. They were not policemen. They did not wear uniforms. They came in a black Toyota with no license plates, and they sat in the vehicle for a long time before one of them stepped out. He was tall, wore a pressed white kaftan, and had the kind of calm that belongs only to men who have done very bad things and stopped feeling guilty about it. He asked Kofi, politely, if he had found anything unusual in the alley behind the Malam Junction market last Tuesday night. Kofi said no. His voice was steady. His hands were not. The man smiled, a slow, patient smile, and said, "That's fine. We'll ask around." They left. Kofi closed the shop early, went home, and told Abina everything. She listened without interrupting, which was the thing he loved most about her, the way she could absorb difficult information with absolute stillness. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment and then said, "We need to move the money. Tonight." They agreed to give themselves 1 week. 1 week to figure out what to do. They would not spend a single cedi. They would not tell anyone. They would think clearly and act wisely. They did not get their week. The men came back on Friday evening, and this time they did not come politely. Kofi was not home. He had gone to buy food at the market. Abina was alone with Akojua when the door came off its hinges. There were 4 of them. They tore the room apart. They found the bag. And before they left, they made sure Abina understood something very clearly: this was not over. When Kofi came home and found his wife on the floor of their broken room, holding their daughter and shaking, the food still in his hands, the evening air still warm around him, something in him went very quiet. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of a man who has just watched his whole world change direction. He dropped the food. He held his wife and child. He did not cry. He was already past that. But what he did not know yet, what he could not have known, was that the men had not just taken the money. Before they left, one of them had placed a call. And by morning, someone in that neighborhood would repeat the name Kofi Mensah to the wrong person. And the wrong person would decide, for reasons that had nothing to do with justice, that Kofi needed to be made an example. It happened 4 days later. Kofi's shop burned down in the night. No one saw who did it. No one came forward. The fire was too quick and too clean to be an accident, and the police who came the next morning asked 2 questions and then left without writing anything down. Kofi stood in the ash and the morning light and looked at what remained of 12 years of his life, the tools he had bought one by one, the engine parts he had collected, the certificate from the polytechnic he'd hung on the wall, all of it gone. A blackened frame. A concrete floor covered in soot. His neighbor, old Mama Efua, came and stood beside him and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "The fire does not decide who survives it. You do." He didn't understand those words yet. He would. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Kofi's life. They moved from their room in Nima to a single space in his mother's house in Medina, 3 adults and a child in 2 rooms, sleeping in shifts, stepping over each other. Kofi's mother, a woman named Grace who had worked as a seamstress for 40 years and still sat at her machine every morning, asked no questions and made no complaints. She simply made space. That was her language of love. Kofi looked for work. He was a good mechanic, one of the best in the neighborhood, people said, but word travels fast in Accra, and the story that traveled was not the true one. Rumors had attached themselves to his name, that he had stolen money, that he was involved with criminals, that his shop had been burned because of something he did. None of it was true. All of it stuck. 3 garages turned him away in 1 week. A 4th hired him for 2 days and then let him go without explanation. He did odd jobs, fixing a generator here, replacing brake pads there, for whatever people would pay, which was never enough. Abina, who had been working part-time at a fabric shop, increased her hours. She came home tired and ate quietly and got up early and went back. She never complained about it to Kofi, not once, but he could see what the tiredness was doing to her, the way it sat behind her eyes. And it broke something in him every morning to watch her leave. Akojoa started having nightmares. She would wake up crying in the night and not be able to explain what she had dreamed. She stopped wanting to go to school. Her teacher sent a note home saying she had become very quiet in class, that she sat alone during break time. Kofi read that note 3 times and then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and carried it with him for a week without knowing exactly why. He carried a lot of things that way, silently, folded up, close to his chest. There were nights he couldn't sleep. He would lie in the dark and run the numbers, what they owed, what they earned, the gap between those 2 things, and the gap was always too wide. He began to feel like a man standing at the edge of something very deep, trying not to look down. One evening, Emmanuel came to visit. His brother sat with him on the steps outside the house, and they drank Sobolo in silence for a while, watching the neighborhood settle into night. Then Emmanuel said, "You know it's not your fault." Kofi said nothing. Finding that bag, that wasn't a crime. What those men did, that was the crime. You didn't cause this. I brought it home, Kofi said. I should have left it. Maybe, Emmanuel said. But you were thinking of your family. That's not a bad thing to be guilty of. Kofi looked at the ground. I think about the fire every day. I think about what I had and what I lost, and I try to figure out where the fault line is, where it started. And I always come back to that alley. That moment when I picked it up. Then start from a different question, Emmanuel said. Not where it started. Where it goes from here. The conversation stayed with Kofi. It was around this time that he met Pastor Nana. Pastor Nana ran a small community center not far from Medina Market, a converted warehouse with plastic chairs and a generator that cut out every few hours. He was not the kind of man who shouted from a pulpit. He was more like a man who opened a door and waited to see who walked through it. He found Kofi one afternoon sitting outside the community center, not because Kofi had come looking for anything spiritual, but because the center had a small tool loan program for tradespeople who had lost equipment, and Emmanuel had told him about it. They spoke for 2 hours. Kofi told him things he had not told anyone, not just about the fire, but about the shame. About how he had started to see himself as someone things happened to, rather than someone who made things happen. About how he looked at Akojua's face in the morning and felt afraid, because he was her father and he was supposed to be a wall between her and the hard parts of the world, and the wall had a crack in it now. Pastor Nana listened to all of this, and then he said something Kofi did not expect. He said, "The crack is not the problem. The crack is where you let the light in. The question is whether you're going to seal it up and pretend it isn't there, or whether you're going to build something stronger around it." It sounds simple, maybe. Simple things often do, when you say them aloud. But Kofi drove home that evening with something different in his chest, not hope exactly, not yet. But the first suggestion of it. The possibility of a direction. He borrowed the tools from the community center program. He started doing repairs again, small ones, informal ones, out of the yard behind his mother's house. He charged what he could. He saved every cedi that didn't go toward rent or food. He started getting up an hour earlier each morning to work before the sun got too hot. Slowly, the customers came back. Not the old ones, most of those were gone, absorbed by other mechanics, moved on. But new ones. People who had heard from someone else that there was a man in Medina who worked carefully and charged fairly and showed up when he said he would. Abina noticed the change first. She told him one evening that he seemed lighter, that's the word she used, lighter. Like he was carrying the same weight but had figured out how to distribute it differently across his shoulders. He laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in weeks. It surprised him. 2 years after the fire, Kofi Mensah opened a new shop. It was not big, 2 bays, a concrete forecourt, a hand-painted sign his brother Emmanuel had done over a weekend. It was in Ashiaman, a little farther from where he'd grown up, in a neighborhood that needed a good mechanic the way lungs need air. He had saved for 14 months to afford the lease deposit, cutting every corner he could without cutting into his family's basic needs. He had applied for a small business loan through a government scheme and been rejected twice before being approved on the 3rd attempt. The day he opened, he swept the forecourt himself, set up his tools in the order he liked, and stood in the morning light for a long moment, hands at his sides, just breathing. Abina brought Akojua. His mother came. Emmanuel brought Sobolo and Banku wrapped in foil. Pastor Nana came and said a short prayer, nothing dramatic, just a quiet word of gratitude aimed at something larger than all of them. The first customer showed up before he'd finished eating. What made Kofi's second shop different from his first wasn't just its location or its size. It was the man running it. The old Kofi had been skilled but passive, a man who was good at his work but had never really thought of himself as someone who could grow beyond it. The new Kofi had the same skill, but now paired with something else. A kind of focused intentionality. A man who had lost things and rebuilt them new, in a way that could not be taught in a classroom or a book, what things were actually made of. He hired an apprentice within 6 months. A boy named Bright, 17 years old, from the neighborhood, who reminded Kofi a little of himself at that age, quick hands, sharp eyes, a hunger to learn things the right way. He paid Bright a fair wage. He taught him patiently. He told him, one afternoon when they were working on a transmission together, the work will make you or break you. That's not a threat, it's the truth. But you're the one who decides which one it is. Bright looked up at him with grease on his forehead and said, "How do you know you made it?" Kofi thought about it for a while. Then he said, "When I stopped waiting for things to stop being hard. When I understood that hard is not the same as hopeless." It was also around this time that something unexpected happened. One of the men from the black Toyota, not the tall man in the white kaftan, but one of the others, came to the shop one morning. Not with a thread this time. With a broken radiator hose and the look of a man who had not slept well in a long time. He didn't seem to recognize Kofi immediately. Or maybe he did, and he needed the repair more than he needed to pretend otherwise. He sat in the plastic chair outside the shop while Kofi walked, and they didn't speak for most of it. When Kofi handed him the keys and named the price, the man paid without bargaining. Then he said, quietly, "I remember you." Kofi looked at him. "I know." A long silence. "I needed the money then," the man said, by way of something that was not quite an apology. "It doesn't," he stopped. "It doesn't explain it." "No," Kofi said. "It doesn't." The man nodded. He got in his car. He left. Kofi stood in the forecourt for a while after he'd gone. He turned the moment over in his mind, the smallness of it, the inadequacy of it, the way it had come and gone without drama. He had spent 2 years carrying something heavy about that whole chapter of his life, and now here was one of the men responsible for it, sitting in a plastic chair with a broken radiator hose, looking tired and older and somehow smaller than the figure who had loomed so large in Kofi's memory. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel the release he'd imagined forgiveness might bring. He felt something quieter than that, a kind of clarity. A recognition that the story he'd been living was not about those men at all. It had never been about them. It was about what he chose to do with the shape that had been left in him after everything collapsed. That evening, he picked up Okoshua from school. She came running across the yard toward him, 9 years old now, her school bag bouncing, her face bright, and he caught her up in his arms and held her for a moment longer than usual. "Papa," she said, wriggling, "people are watching." "Let them," he said. She laughed. That sound, that particular, specific sound, was worth everything. Every early morning and every denied loan application and every evening running numbers in the dark. It was worth the bag in the alley and the fire and the months in his mother's house and every moment of doubt he'd carried between then and now. He drove home. Resilience is not a dramatic thing. It doesn't look the way movies want it to look, no single moment where the music swells and the hero rises and everything clicks into place. Real resilience is quieter than that. It is the choice, made again and again, to wake up and try. It is a mechanic sweeping a forecourt at dawn. It is a woman who goes back to work when she is tired. It is a mother who makes space without being asked. It is a brother who says, "Start from a different question." Kofi Mensah found a bag full of money in an alley, and it cost him more than money could buy. But what grew back from the ash of his shop, and the long months of struggle, and the slow deliberate work of rebuilding, what grew back was stronger than what had burned. That is not an accident. That is a choice. Made thousands of times, in thousands of small moments, when no one was watching. If you have been in your own ash, if you are standing in the remains of something you built and trying to figure out what comes next, I want you to know something: the fire does not decide who survives it. You do. Thank you for listening to Stories by the King. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me about a time when you had to rebuild something. Until next time, keep surviving. Keep growing. Keep going.